So 13.1 is all about periodic data. Periodic just means something that repeats over and over again. Like you have 4 periods in the day. That period of time keeps repeating over and over. So a periodic function is just a function that repeats over and over again. So a periodic function is a function that repeats its y values. Now it's also important that it repeats these y values at regular intervals. So y values, or our outputs, at regular intervals. So in the same amount of time, the y values are repeating. So like you can see on this graph to the right, these same y values keep repeating over and over again in the same amount of time. So a cycle is just what we call one completed pattern. So if we look at this graph on the right, this pattern keeps repeating over and over again. I could identify one cycle a couple different ways. If I started at this point, we have all these y values, they drop back down. That would be considered one cycle. It covers all of the different y values this graph is going to keep repeating. The cycle didn't have to start there. It could have started at this point and gone down and back up to the same y value. This is also the example of one cycle. So how we measure a cycle is with its horizontal distance. From the start to the end of a cycle, we call that a period. So the period is just the horizontal length, or the distance along the x-axis of one cycle. So a period is the horizontal distance. Horizontal just means along the x-axis. Of one cycle. So in this graph to the right, this is my period. I'm going from an x value of negative 1, 2, 3, 4. So from x equals negative 4 to x equals negative 1. That was my period. My period was 3 units long. The next vocabulary word is midline. Midline just means the halfway point between the maximum and minimum values. So you take the highest y value, take the lowest y value, halfway in between those is going to be your midline. So the midline is a horizontal line. That is halfway between the maximum and minimum y values. So the equation we use to come up with this midline, it's a horizontal line, so the equation is y equals, it's 1/2 of the max value plus the minimum value. So it's halfway between those 2 points. In this example on the right, the maximum y value is 4. The minimum y value is negative 2. So the midline is going to be at y equals 1/2 the maximum value plus the minimum value. So that gives us y equals 1/2 of 2, y equals 1 is going to be this midline right in between the two. The amplitude is just how far the graph ever fluctuates from that midline. So in this example, if this is at y equals 1, the graph is never more than 3 units away from it on top and 3 units away from it on bottom. So the amplitude, another way to think about it, it's how far it is from the midline, or it's half the distance between the maximum and minimum values. So the amplitude is half the distance between the maximum and minimum values. Or another way to think about it is how far it is from the midline. How far the maximum point is from the midline, how far the minimum point is from the midline. So the equation we can use to find amplitude is 1/2 the difference between the max value and the minimum value. So in this example, we said no value was ever 3 more away from the midline. We also could have said that the amplitude is 1/2 the maximum value of 4 minus the minimum value of -2. That's 1/2 of 6, gives us an amplitude of 3. So how can we apply all of those definitions? If we look at this first example, it's asking us to draw a cycle on the graph. Now you can start your cycle anywhere you want to. Say we start at a peak. One cycle would just be to trace the graph until we get back to that same y value. So that would be one cycle. Trace all those y values until you're back to where you were. The period is then that horizontal distance that creates a cycle. So from -3 to 1, that's 4 units. That means our period is 4. To find the midline, we do 1/2 y equals 1/2. The maximum value is 2, plus the minimum value is -2. So our midline ends up being just at y equals 0. It's perfectly symmetric around y equals 0. Finally, our amplitude just means how far are we ever from the midline. So amplitude is 1/2 the maximum value of 2 minus the minimum value of -2. That gives us 1/2 of 4. Our amplitude is 2. The maximum value is 2 away from the midline. The minimum value is also 2 away from the midline. If we look at the second graph, first we have to determine if it's periodic or not. Even though it keeps making the same curved shape, these y values are not repeating. The y values actually keep going down, down, down. So it's not repeating the same y values over and over again. So it's not periodic. If we look at this final example, we're asked if this is periodic or not. Well, we can trace the same shape, the same y values keep repeating. That is periodic. This pattern keeps repeating. So one cycle would be to cover all those y values. The period is the horizontal distance from -2 to 4. That gives us a distance of 6. Our midline is y equals 1/2 of the maximum value, which is 3, plus the minimum value, which is 0. Our midline is at y equals 3/2. If we drew that on the graph, at 1.5, be somewhere along here would be our midline. To find the amplitude is 1/2 the maximum value minus the minimum value. So that amplitude is also 3/2.